One of my very favorite parts of doing prop making is the weathering, making this look just dirty enough that it's more believable. Today I'm going to do just a quick basic wash to make this thing come to life. And here it is, my M5 Phalanx heavy pistol from Mass Effect 2, my favorite Mass Effect. And I've done all my masking to get it looking super clean and pretty and nice, but it's too clean, it's too nice. Even if this just came off the factory floor, it still looks too clean. Now, if this were a real thing, not a prop, oh, the cat food's going off. Now this is a cast resin prop, it's all one piece, and these details are just cut into the surface. But if this were a real thing, a real manufactured item, these would probably be two different pieces that were then attached. And even if these two parts had really high tolerances, there still would be a little bit more of a gap in there. So to sell that, we can do a dark wash with some black or brown paint, trap a little bit of pigment down in there, create a little more contrast, and make something that looks a little bit more believable. That's what we're gonna do today. The paints I'm using are cheap acrylic paints. This is a flow acrylic. Means it's a little bit more liquidy than some of your more heavy body paints. I also have this stuff here. It says fluid acrylic on there, similar stuff, which is different compared to a heavy body paint like this, which is much more pigmented. Now, that doesn't mean you can't use this for weathering. In fact, there's plenty of other special techniques you can use with this kind of paint. But for just a normal wash, I'm going to use my flow acrylics, this stuff, and I'm even going to water it down a little bit. I'm even using really cheap brushes here. They're going to get beat up. In fact, these are brushes that I've already beat up through normal daily wear, and I save them for weathering. I've also got some chip brushes here if you need to cover a ton of area on your proper costume. Chip brushes are awesome. And then I've got a plastic dish or palette here to work with, and I also have a jar of water at the ready. So I can put just a little bit of paint down on my palette. Oh, that was a lot, that's fine. Grab some water out of my brush right there, and then use that to thin out my paint. What I want is a really thin, watered down paint. I don't want a ton of pigment in there because I just want it to capture a tiny bit of that pigment on my prop. So I load up my brush and take it over to my prop. But before I get started, there's one very important consideration we need to make before we lay down a ton of dark paint, and that's whether or not we should clear coat our prop before we weather it. Usually it's a good idea to spray some kind of clear barrier in between the base coat of paint and the weathering paint. What can happen is this water or acrylic paint in it can soften the layer below it, mix them together, and strip the paint from below, which would be a real bummer. Now this prop, I let it dry for a couple of days. It shouldn't happen. However, the white paint here is actually a primer. I sprayed it with a white primer and figured why not just use that for the color because it looked fine. However, that primer is really intent on grabbing whatever paint goes on top of it. So I sprayed this whole thing with a bit of gloss varnish. This is a fast drying varnish, just got it from the art supply store. Spray it on one or two good layers so that there is now a nice barrier in between my painted finish and the weathering paint. So the process for doing a wash is super simple. You just lay down a ton of your weathering paint on the surface, being sure to drive it down into the crevices and details. Then once you've covered one area fairly well, you can take a damp cloth and wipe it off. Now this is a white prop and the contrast is quite stark. That's why I use this as an example. You can see that it's grabbing onto some of that surface. Fortunately, you can go in with that wet cloth and try and clean it up as much as possible. It also depends on how dirty you want that. I don't want this one to be super dirty, so I'm going to try and buff that as much as I can. But with a white prop, sometimes that's just how it goes. I'm okay with that. And there we go. There is a lot of water down in there. My cat's trying to bury his food in the floor. You done, buddy? No? So there is a ton of water down there along with a little bit of that pigment. Now it looks pretty stark right now, but as that water evaporates, it'll just leave a little bit of that paint pigment below. It'll be a little bit more subtle. One of the other reasons why we'll want to do a wash like this is to cover up some of our masking errors. I did spend a good amount of time trying to get the masking perfect on this, but sometimes it's unavoidable. You can see a little bit of that masking was mismatched right there, and the seam doesn't look quite the way I want it. So we can hide that with our wash. Again, really simple, just bathe the area in your really thin paint and then wipe most of it away. You'll end up with more paint on your rag than in the prop. That's just kind of how it is. But we can see after wiping it down that crevice has some black pigment in there, and it's much more difficult to see where I goofed on the masking. And that's the gist of it. You just cover big areas of your prop with your very wet paint and then wipe most of it away. So I'm gonna cover this side super quick and show you what it looks like compared to the clean side. That's a really wet layer there. It's mostly water. And I'm gonna go back in with a very damp cloth to clean as much of that up as I can. So you got a lot of pigment on your paper towel there. Try using a clean area to get more off, especially these white spots that I want to be more clean looking. You can also alternate with a dry paper towel to remove more of the pigment. So here it is after having left it dry for a little while. If you leave this like overnight, you'll see a pretty drastic difference as more of that water evaporates. But this is the dirty side right here, and I will compare it to the clean side, the mostly clean side anyway. And that bit of grime, and especially the contrast, really starts to set the prop apart. Makes it look a little bit more world-worn and realistic. And I've only really spent about 10 minutes on this so far, so if you want to add that little bit of extra realism to your prop, this is a great way to get started down that path. There are, of course, plenty of other things you can do to sort of augment what we've done here. Consider this a first layer, but if you want to do more storytelling with your prop or just make it a little bit more zingy, then consider some different colors you can put down. Now this is a space gun made of space metal that I don't think rusts, but if you have a prop that does rust, you could start with a wash of some burnt sienna to give it that kind of ruddy red color and some of the cracks and crevices. If you really want it to look rusty, look at some real rusty stuff in the world and look at all the different colors that go into it. So this will get you started, but there's a lot more you can do to augment your rust color. Also think maybe your prop lives in the desert, so the dust and stuff that settles in the cracks is not brown or black, but tan or light brown. Also, this hand grip here is all black and there are crevices in there, you can just barely see it. So even though this isn't necessarily part of the story of this prop, I'm gonna go in with some yellow ochre paint to do a little bit of crevice weathering right there. Again, just brushing on a very wet amount of the paint and then wiping almost all of it away. Now that might look a little bit stark right now, but again, as that dries, that will lessen. And that adds, again, more contrast for us. I spent a lot of time detailing and modeling that part of the handle, and I want to be able to see it. So a little contrast should go a long way. Something to think about, you will get dirty. Your hands will get dirty when you do this. You could wear gloves if you want to, I guess. I have nothing really to worry about with these acrylic paints. And besides, there's something kind of satisfying about ending the day with dirty, paint-covered hands. Makes me feel like I accomplished something today. There we go, got my baby puke yellow down and just gonna wipe it away. Remember too, as I let this dry and the color kind of changes to its final hue, I could decide to do another wash. I might be happy with the black wash that I've done, but I could go back maybe with a brown or maybe some of this yellow ochre in select areas to give it a little bit more variation. So let's say I just add a little bit of yellow here and there. Again, not everywhere, but just mix it up a little bit to make it look a little less uniform. There we go. Not too bad. And again, I'm gonna let this dry before I sort of settle on what I think it should look like. As it changes over time, I might decide it needs a little more, a little less in different areas. And that's all part of the storytelling that you can do with weathering. And that is my little primer on doing weathering in very wet washes using acrylic paints on your props. Of course, this is just the tip of the iceberg as far as techniques are concerned for weathering and making your prop look like it's part of the real world. I'm going to tackle some more of those in some upcoming videos, so look forward to that. But if you want to jump start, my pal Harrison over at Volpin Props has a book on painting that I highly recommend you go get. It's an ebook. It's full of tons of wonderful information. And thank you so much for checking out the video. Hopefully you learned something that's going to help you out on your next proper costume project. If you're new, go ahead and hit that subscribe button. We have new videos coming out every single week. You don't want to miss them. If you have any questions about this technique or anything else I've covered, go ahead and hit me up in the comments. I'll see if I can help you out. Also, if you're working on a really cool prop project, doing some weathering of your own, please share them with me over on Twitter. I'm at Chinbeard. That's all I have for this guy here. I'm going to let this dry, go paint the other side, and hang it up next to all of my other Mass Effect guns on the wall. Thanks again so much for hanging out with me in the shop today, and I will see you in the next build.